All right, Prasanta, so great to have you on the show.
So happy to be here. This is awesome. Great seeing you.
Likewise. So, what are your current research interests? I know you're kind of relocated for a year. What are you working on there?
Yeah, so for this Fulbright, I'm trying to switch gears a little bit and learn. So I became a full professor last year, and it's like a midlife crisis for everybody who turns full because it's like, now what? So I usually work on deep time, uh, systematics, tree of life stuff. And I figured while I'm up in Ottawa, Canada, I'd work with some folks who do some evolution and action stuff. So, what things are happening today that we can set up for tests for tomorrow or to look at things that happened more recently. So, I have this my box of DNA tubes for all the specimens that we're trying to collect, ice fishing and going out into the Ottawa River and other places where I usually don't work, which is the tropics.
Mhm.
Uh, Being in cold weather is different. But trying to get samples of things that are up here that we can use for comparisons with tropical species or even in temporal time with things after they build a dam or after an introduced species comes to a place where collecting what happens. And so just trying to build that infrastructure up here for a better understanding in the future.
Okay, so I have to ask, midlife crisis, the academic midlife crisis. Can you speak a little bit more to that? Like what
you know,
happened, and
it
is that
wasn't,
common?
I think, a colleague told me, grad school takes forever. And then you're a senior academic like that. And it's totally true. Like I gave a talk this morning at McGill University, whereas my undergrad alma mater, and it's been 20 years since I was an undergrad there. And I don't think like I'm having a real midlife crisis, but I'm having, I feel like it's time to transition and see like how different or how I can expand the science that I do. Not just the science, but also the reach of the science. So a big goal for me is building scientific infrastructure abroad and in the places that I work. So a lot of my work is in the neotropics, and I've had students from Guatemala and Honduras and Cuba now. And that's really important to me is incorporating the work of the people where I work into my work and help expand that scientific infrastructure. And I think I'm learning as I go because that used to not be a goal for most people. And it just didn't make sense for me that it wasn't. And so my science has gotten better by incorporating those folks into my lab and into my work, and trying to preach that gospel a bit.
Yeah, can you speak more to that? So this like seems like um, we're both friends with Asha, and I've been kind of following her work about anti-colonialism in science, right? Like this idea of parachute science, people just dropping in, doing tests or running experiments, then taking off and publishing results. Um, what When you say infrastructure, what do you mean?
I mean, where we can go into the field where people live, and do the science there in collaboration with my lab or whoever's lab in the West, so that we're not just flying in or helicoptering in or parachuting in, taking the science and forgetting about those folks. Actually, since you said I could share a slide, I'll share a slide. That's cool with you. Let me just
Hmm.
skip up here because it's really about, the boots on the ground are forgotten once you leave the ground. And that's always bothered me a bit. And let's share this screen. This is a figure from a paper we're working on about helicopter science. I don't know if you saw the helicopter go, but
Hmm.
basically, the folks on the ground help with permits and sometimes the field work. And then, what happens to them? Maybe I'm a curator of fishes, so I have jars of animals, and it should have the names of the people that helped collect, but it should also continue past the museum shelf stage into the publications. And vouchering is just keeping a record of the specimens that people are working on. And I'm talking about specimens because a lot of the genomic work that I do and others do forget the source material. And if you forget the people on the ground, you're going to forget the source material too. And there's a lot of genomes out there that don't link back to that early steps. And I think having that link between the local environment and the ecology, the evolution, the genomic work that comes out of it, it just needs to be curated as a whole. We need to keep those links going no matter the science, because a lot of the science being done does rely on the kinds of things that we're picking up on the ground. And it gets lost in the system somehow. And I think recognizing the people in the places that we work will help inspire them to keep them on the publications, keep working with them, keep training them. And that's how you build scientific infrastructure in these places that don't have the infrastructure currently. I know you want to talk about funding. It's hard to get that funding.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I was just going to ask, like, what do you think? So one of the interviews I did, and I bring this up a lot, is Paula Stefan. She wrote this book called How Economics Shapes Science. And it is an amazing map of like all the incentives that are, driving science and scientists. And, it kind of makes sense that people do what they do, which is they're very oriented on publications because that's how they get promoted. That's how they get paid. And so I've been kind of really thinking about how to throw a wrench into that cycle, because I think so many people are kind of hitting on that I talk to, right? And I'm trying to talk to a lot of people, throughout science. Something that keeps coming back is this idea of making it more rooted in community and rooting in with people, right? And getting out of the ivory tower. I was listening to a podcast the other day, and George Church was talking about, he said, I'm a little concerned that at the end of this COVID thing, that all of us, biotechnologists are going to pat ourselves on the back and say, look, we created these vaccines and we created these antivirals and look at us. When the actuality is, like, if you look at a lot of the countries that have done the best against COVID, it's masks, right? It's like social cohesion and understanding of like a broader understanding of science and the right thing to do. And so to me, that's like a really good point, is that science is not enough if it's advancing really fast in the ivory tower. It only matters if it's tightly coupled with culture and with society. And so bringing that back, it seems to me like there are real incentive problems. What are you seeing in that realm, and like what would you propose to fix it?
Well, I love how you put that. That's perfect, because it's true. You in grad school you learn to communicate science with other scientists. You learn how to write papers because you're taught that's the only currency. You need 10 pubs or 20 pubs to get a job, and it has to be in these journals. And you need a grant to repay your startup, and that's it, right? And you're leaving out, if the idea is communicating the science, you want to communicate with non-scientists too, so more people understand why it's important. Working at the federal government, you see that intersection a bit. So there's at NSF, the people you're worried about are the staffers for Congress people, reading through what grants got funded because they say that's a waste of money, even though it's like a pittance. $8 billion for NSF. 80 or whatever billion for NIH, which is medical. It's true. The incentive should be like, who are you inspiring to become the next Louis Pasteur or Marie Curie? That's it's not just teaching. It's actually generating new scientists and new science by inspiring. And there's very little credit for that. There's the invisible mentoring that many minority women especially do, that they get zero credit for. Everybody's talking about increasing diversity and doing the work of DEI work, and who's doing it? It's the people who are in that group. And everybody else is patting themselves on the back if they hire a few people. But you have to support those folks too. And it's not just pubs, it's not just grants, it goes well beyond that. And maybe, David, you're saying, how do we change it? If we can change the granting system to support the incentivizing of science outreach, not just communicating among scientists. That's a big shift in the culture. That'll take some time.
You know, it's interesting because we've been proposing these kind of experiments on experiment, right? Like I just published this one about fixing the back burner. And there's a real hesitancy. You know, like everyone kind of agrees that the system isn't optimal. It's not working very well, or it's working, but it's not, like, it could be better. At least everyone agrees on that. And almost everyone agrees that we should be trying new things. Like, we should be bold about experimenting with new ways of getting grants out and funding folks. But there's like almost a brick wall to actually running those experiments and testing it out. It's very hard to get funding for these kind of novel ideas. And I think that's why when you see, I don't know if you're familiar with the, Emergent Ventures, they ran this thing called fast grants for COVID relief, where they were giving grants out in 2 days. And they got a bunch of philanthropists to fund it. And now everybody cites this and go, look, it's fast grants, they're doing this. And it's like, it's actually not, we should be running tons of experiments like that. The fact that we only have a handful of those to point to and look at is, to me, really unfortunate, right? Like, everyone's like, should we fund people or projects? We have HHMI or, NIH. And it's like, we're having that debate because those are the 2 examples we have, right? Like, we're just not, I don't think we're trying hard enough. That's my kind of thought.
You made me think of something. So, when, if you're judged by a jury of your peers, if they're all one group, let's say scientists that have only known the currency of publications and grants, and they're judging you as peers, the peer review system is basically how you get grants, all organizations. If they only know that way, they're only judging you on those metrics. If we diversify who the peer reviewers are, then we start changing, because someone's digging a little deeper than just the grants and pubs. Now I'm a hardcore academic. I've written books about academia and success, and I've been a federal government employee, but I know that if we change, how we regulate the grants, that can be done top down. And it has to start from the top. I actually like NSF system. Among the federal government, it's like the gold standard, because the peer review system isn't the only one. If at NIH, the panel says this is the best grant, that's where the money has to go. At NSF, the program officers, which I was among those, you get to look a little bit further down, like who have we not funded and why? Who is poorly reviewed and why? So there's a lot of behind the scenes sort of infrastructure work that's really annoying, because you're writing to nobody, but it helps you, further review what's been done, and so it helps diversify where the money goes, which is nice. But it would also be great to sort of flip the system a little bit and see, who can we bring in, because most of the people that are reviewing the grants have already gotten NSF grants. So it's harder for folks to get into the system. And people don't know NSF does fund small businesses. It does fund free play of free individual kind of basic science research, which is its core mission, to fund basic science research. But you still have to be cutting edge. And what's cutting edge mean? And how do you convince somebody that this new thing is even beyond the cutting edge? So it has to be a little safe too. And they're always playing this dance of like, how do we balance all that? It's tough, you never know. And you have to be willing to accept some failed grants too, to be that risky.
Yeah, I just wrote this essay and I was kind of looking at the data of the sugar grants. I don't know if you're familiar with these, the SGER grants, which is the predecessor of eager and rapid grants. So it's meant to be kind of that pot of money for small amounts to go out for risky stuff. And the data is pretty amazing. Like they had good results. Like 1 in 10 resulted in transformative research. But what they found when they reviewed the program was it was underutilized. Like NSF programmers weren't spending the full bucket of money they had in those amounts. And I thought that was really interesting. And the researchers kind of, drew the conclusion that, that there was kind of risk aversion because they weren't maximizing the amount of money. I don't know if that's actually the right thing to take away from that. But before we get into that, can you just because I'm not an academic, I've never worked at the NSF, I've never applied for it. I've read a lot about it. Can you walk me through the process of becoming a program officer and what you knew going into it, what training you got about how to give out grants, and what was surprising to you, or just walk me through that actual human experience.
Sure. So I didn't think about being a program officer until a colleague of mine had done it for a year. And once you're in the government bosom, you sort of forget how to talk to people, right? So I didn't learn exactly from him how it worked, but I'll tell you because I still remember. Because the best people to talk to about being a program officer are ex-program officers. And NSF's great because they have lots of program officers. Some are permanent and half are rotators. So they're always looking to cycle people in because that's the voice of the general public or the general scientist communicating their wants and needs. So after tenure, you can settle in and do some external service that maybe you wouldn't jump into, and you can take a leave a whole year, which I did, to rotate as a program officer. And I was recruited in by somebody who was at the foundation at the time and said, just come in, give a talk, and we'll get back to you. It's kind of they always have open positions. They might take you this year or a few years down. And you give a presentation, and I talked about grants that I'd been funded by NSF. So they're looking for people that have that experience getting grants, but also having sat on panels. So I sat on 2 or 3 panels by that time reviewing grants with other scientists and faculty, academics. And I gave the presentation. I said, yes, I'd be available this time, not this year, maybe next year. And then they say, yeah, we'd love to have you. We have an open rotator position now. And can you do it this next coming academic year? And it turned out I could. They work with the university to pay you better because you're moving your family and so they pay pretty well.
So you actually went to DC?
Yeah, this was all, obviously pre-COVID where you can go. And so it wasn't a virtual talk. It was doing that. So post tenure at LSU, I think I applied that next year to do. So that was 2016, 2017. And they work with the university. The university gets a little chunked for letting you go, and then they pay you to move and all that. And so as a program officer, you then run panels. That's your big thing, is to then call in folks to be part of panels to review grants. And that's your main task. And then you do the administration of running the panels, which includes not just who to bring in, but which grants people will review. So you're looking for broad expertise. You're looking for diversity. I actually tried to get wondering if I could get a panel completely almost all women. And, I didn't want to overburden the few women that are in academia, but I did, we got almost 50%, which was actually pretty good with that goal. But also, people from PUIs, or primary undergrad institutes, PUIs, people from, post tenure, but also people in pre-tenure. So you think about diversity in every axis that you can in terms of the grants that you're reviewing. It's a big place. I mean, NSF has, go.
So what you're describing, what I'm hearing is it sounds like you're trained not to decide. You're almost trained to facilitate a system. Is that right? Would
Yeah.
you say?
So it's I used to say it's almost like being a venture capitalist for the government, except it's
Hmm.
not your money. It's not your money, and it's much more like a team effort to figure out where the funds should go.
Hmm.
But yeah, you're not it's not your decision alone. Um, or even just the program officers in their cluster, reviewing the grants of the subject matter that they're experts. It's a whole foundation thing. So there's this, they give you the list of acronyms that people throw around like crazy, and then they give you the hierarchy of the foundation, and who's reviewing the grants after you handle it.
Mm.
You have to fight for grants. You have to say these are what we came up with and why. This is how much we want to spend, and then it's a delicate balance. Um, but the training is, you've had the experience being on a panel. Now can you run some of these? The weird training is that you have to learn the Windows 95 government infrastructure of actually like where reports go, and that's boring.
Yeah.
But other than that, there's not a whole lot of you learn with the mentors from the other POs that have been there for a little while.
So is there, and I just downloaded this, I apologize, I haven't read it, but like I've been thinking about transformative research, right? Like I'm really interested in this eager program of like, they're actually trying to skip peer review in some aspects and get smaller amounts out to lots of people. And then there was this kind of packet on what people should prepare, how that people should think about transformative research. Did you get that kind of education when you were there?
Yeah,
And
yeah,
how did you interpret it, or what did you think about that?
yeah. The T word, transformative. If you have your transformative all over your grant, it's probably not. So it's like,
Right.
but they do want research that's moving the science forward, even though it's fundamental, basic science research.
Mhm.
It's still cutting edge research that they're looking for. But it can't be too risky that it can't be done. And that's why the eagers are there, because if it won't survive peer review, is it still worth funding this project uh, outside of the normal panel to push the science forward? Is it too risky for a panel, but really good and worth funding? POs are afraid to fund those because you don't want to make a big mistake. And people, would love to skip peer review and get small amounts of funding. So you get these, periodically. But what you're looking for as a PO is like, why wouldn't this fit in a panel?
Mm.
Why should this one escape panel review, and the three of us or four of us decide on our own that it's worthy of funding? So those are rare. It's better to have the panel look at it, different group of expertise looking at it, and so it's rare to get one of those PO thumbs up. I tried to put one in after I was a PO, and I know the system,
Mm.
and you kind of have to make it sound too risky for panel, but not so risky that it's ludicrous.
Okay, so there's another process for that kind of. There's another track for the eager. You still have to get approval from someone or some other people. It's not just like you can't just quickly write a check and let it go.
No, man, it's never that easy. It's government.
Right, right,
So,
right.
yeah, but it is smaller. You do skip the
Mm-hmm.
panel, but the program officers themselves are looking at it, and then they
Mm.
have to say, how much do we have in our budget? If we just funded eagers, you wouldn't have any panels, and then people who apply for regular grants would be asking you what's going on, so it wouldn't be fair. So it's all about fairness and trying to not get people to cheat the system.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but sometimes there's a lot more money than normal years. Like this year, there's COVID funding, so
Mm-hmm.
that'll probably be a surplus. There were surplus years in the past, so putting an
Yeah.
idea out, talking. It's a great way to have a conversation with a program officer who can't wait. They can't wait to talk to you anyway, because it's pretty lonely in those cubicles.
So they like, yeah, that's so interesting because I've pitched VCs. I've spent the past 10 years pitching VCs and angel investors and stuff like that. So it's very different, because they, especially angel investors, pride themselves on just believing in people, just being early and just saying, you know what, this is crazy, but I'm going to do it. And then, turn around and write a check in a couple of days. And that's the kind of thing I've been thinking about. It's like, where is that in science, right? Like, where is that like encouragement and belief and early money to just get something going and get something off the ground? I was doing history on the history of scientific grant funding, and in France, they started the system a couple hundred years ago, and they called them encouragements before they called them grants. And it was this idea that we're going to give small amounts out to lots of people, and the goal is that we're going to get a lot of people playing. We're going to start a lot of things, right? And I love that word. And I'm actually kind of like thinking about how to use that in the experiment work, because I think there's so much peer review, like grants, like all of this is like the language is of permission. And what I love about encouragement is that it's like this, the language of belief, like, let's keep going. Let's try this, and like, and collaboration. And so I'm trying to like think about like ways we can use slightly different language, getting away from this language of permission and towards this language of like mutual support, and like figuring out how we can accomplish things together. Anyways,
but I like that too. And the Canadian system is much more like everybody gets a little bit. Some people get a lot, but they give a lot more to get you going. And if you stay sort of productive, the difference is like if you want to go big, and an NSF grant makes a career. So if you want to go NIH too, or DARPA, if you want to go big, you want more funding for fewer people. If you want everybody to kind of chug along, maybe the better system is the encouragement, give everybody until they prove you wrong. But I mean, but there is diversity outside of NSF, right? Like you can get money from NASA, DARPA, NIH, there's even within the federal government. Not everybody has the charisma to believe in themselves to get angel funding. People just don't, so what happens to the nerdy scientists in the corner, so they need, but you also have to be, somewhat interesting enough to write an NSF grant too, because a boring grant, people have biases, and you try to fight those biases. But if you play a safe grant, that's also not going to get funded.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Well, this is kind of, I don't know if you read my like essay about this, but sorry to make this all about like.
That's right. And I want to read it. I haven't yet read it.
No worries. Well, my proposal is like, let's give 10 people $100,000 budgets for them to dish out on experiment, and they can write those in like $5,000 checks or $2,000 checks. And then the cool thing about experiment is people will raise more money on top of that, right? Like they'll, go out and raise money from the crowd. So it'll be like, probably 5x that. So like a $2,000 check might, get funded $10,000 project, which is cool. And just like maximum autonomy to these folks, right? Like almost like a mini DARPA program officer, right? Like they're responsible for going out and finding the wallflowers and things like that, and encouraging folks along. And it's such a small amount, right? Like if everyone has $100,000 or something like that, it's like, that's like an eager grant in itself. So you'd hope it can go a long way. But I've been reading this book about JCR Licklider, who was a DARPA program manager who funded, a ton of early stuff around, he funded Doug Engelbart, right, who created the graphical user interface and eventually the ARPANET team and things like that, and like had kind of a vision and would go out and like fund the people who were making the vision happen. So my kind of thesis is like, instead of like relying on the scientists to be so bold, like why don't we try and inspire a little more boldness within the program officer ranks, and maybe we call them something different. Like I was calling them science angels, right? Like actually people who are really supposed to like do risky stuff, like find like really interesting ideas. Anyways, that's kind of my proposal. It's interesting. It's interesting getting feedback about it, because the feedback is like, no, it can't work because it has to go through peer review. It's like everyone is so like thinking about the system, that's like, nah, this will never work. But I explain it to like people in the VC land and entrepreneurship, right, in Silicon Valley, and they're like, yeah, of course. Like, wait, this isn't how it works. And no, it's not how it works. Anyways,
DARPA is an interesting one because they can also fire you, right? So they can
mm-hmm.
say, hey, you're not doing it after a year, and I feel like I have to tell this tangent story. So NSF was like this big building and DARPA was across the street, and DARPA, like, you have to put your phone in the locker room before you, is like super security, but you could see all their offices from above from NSF. It's like, it was good, like I don't know, microcosm of security anyway. But that's,
well, I'll tell you something else. I've been to DARPA and I've talked to program officers there. And what I think is so cool about DARPA is, one, you're checking. It was actually really cool to visit. Like, I found myself like pretty in awe of the place. And it's not like like a building that really stands out, but like on the walls, right? We funded ARPANET. We funded, like, they're celebrating the really transformative ideas, right? So it's not like it's kind of reinforcing this ethos and this mission of, we want the craziest ideas and we're going to fund them, and people have autonomy. And so I thought it was really cool to actually be there and see that they celebrate that. And I wonder if maybe like NSF needs a kind of like a separate building or a separate thing that, kind of just hearing you talk about the Eager program, I think having like a separate building actually matters. Like a group of people. There's a great book from Sophie Bacall called Loonshots, right? Like, you kind of want to sometimes separate those kind of pirates, and that can be a way to kind of get people thinking differently. So I don't know. It's interesting to hear your take on the building.
I mean, NSF's now, it has a beautiful building, and now it's moved from Arlington to Alexandria, but it's not we did this, it's all giving the credit back out. Like, you never hear, the program officer, even the people in charge can't say, we need more money, we're doing great work. It's always about the scientists. I think they have the smallest overhead. They're restricted to something like 90% of the money has to go back out the door, which is amazing. So they run on a tight budget because most of the money has to go back out to people, which is like, I love NSF. I think NSF's made my career. It's made lots of careers. It's not perfect, but it is constricted and hamstrung a little bit from the things that you're talking about, because it has to explain, why are these things getting funded? Who approved this at many different levels. So there's a lot of checks and balances. So I don't know. I think there should be government funding, like you're saying. I don't think it should be from NSF. It shouldn't break away from the kind of give everything away, give the credit away to the people doing the work.
I should say that I do really love and admire everything that NSF does too. And I think that's my takeaway from like doing all of this research on the science of science funding. I don't think it's broken. I actually think by and large, this system is working pretty well. And I think peer review actually is not like, some people think it's like just the worst thing and we should fund people for long periods of time. Like, there's a book called Donald Braben's new book, Scientific, I forget what it's called, but it's about just abolish peer review. That's not me. I don't think it's so broken. I do think it could be improved. Like, I do think there's areas on the margin where we could be doing better. And there's experiments and ideas for alternate funding mechanisms that we should be trying. That's my opinion on it. So Well, I'd love, I don't want to keep you all morning. So I'd love to, like, if you have anything like in the research mode stuff, I'd love to kind of see what you're working on, and kind of see how you take notes and bring things together.
Yeah, I mean, I've been thinking about, like, so this talk this morning, I've been
Yeah.
working on actually, like, I love teaching evolution. Actually, I was
Hmm.
supposed to go to the Galapagos to teach evolution before COVID hit, and I'm writing this book. So I think that I've been working on, and that's more like what, how do I explain this complicated topic to the general public, and then doing a different book, like an edited volume, just like methods in fish biology. So I'm working on two very different things, mostly while I've been up here, besides the, trying to get into the field. But those perspectives for me is like, that's the other part of science. Why do I have to, be a full professor before I really started thinking of those? And you don't. It's just you are bogged down in the grantsmanship and in the publications, which are always churning once you get a lab going. But what I wanted to do something for me this year, and for me it was like writing these books, which you usually don't have time for.
So to clarify, one is like a textbook and the other is like a popular science book.
Yeah, one is the popular science, exactly. The other one's an edited volume where we asked lots of scientists, fish biologists, ichthyologists, to write, how does our field work, and write a different chapter about genomics, write a chapter about, museum science, write a chapter about, how to run a ecological survey, things like that. So hopefully some grad student can pick that up and be
Hopefully I
like,
can pick it up.
yeah, that's right. We need a robotics chapter, man. I need to go out. I still need to work with you on, like, get me out of a cave rescue robot.
Yeah, totally. Well, I mean, that's how the Open ROV started, was sending robots into caves. And so I've thought a lot about it. So anyways, that's a whole separate
Yeah,
adventure.
but yeah, one of the fun things about writing a book, I don't know if I can share the screens, but there's no good Darwin movie.
Mm.
I wrote a Darwin movie. Let me share this real quick. And it's illustrated by this really great science illustrator, Ethan Kosak.
I
And
know him. Yeah.
yeah, he's great. And like he's like, we got the Voyage of the Beagle, the first one, where the Pringle Stokes kills himself, and like a befuddled, a buffoon Darwin, and young Darwin, his dad yelling at him, and like it goes through the history. Like I would love to see this, this movie. And so there's all kinds of stuff that happens in his life. He's worried about his wife's deep faith and his lack of it, and he married his first cousin, and he knows because he's thinking about inbreeding in the sense of pigeons and breeds of dogs and stuff. And his life was so complicated, and such a real movie gets scooped on natural selection, and there's all these great debates, and the Voyage of the Beagle captain that went with him was at the great debates, and also kills himself. So it's like, it's got everything you want. It's like love story, incest, murder, or at least suicide. So I've been thinking about that, but also I bet you don't know this guy. This is John Edmonstone. He was a formerly enslaved uh, man who lived in South America and taught Darwin taxidermy.
Hmm.
And before Darwin went on the Beagle, so you can envision like Edmonstone, this black man from South America who worked with the naturalists, telling Darwin all these great tales of South America and inspiring him to go there. I mean, I just love the idea of that, and this forgotten person in history coming back, 150 years later, to tell his tale. So that's what I want to do. I want to, when I'm working on stuff this year, it's remembering the forgotten folks that maybe we're missing in our discussions of science, and bringing back the boots on the ground to all the science that we do.
That is so cool. I love the visual of this, and I really admire that about you. Um, you're just doing you're doing such serious science in like the typical science route, right? Like you wrote the book on like the guide to academia, but at the same time, you're so experimental in the ways that you're talking about it, right? Like whether that's giving TED Talks or, creating graphic novels, writing all these different books, giving talks. I think that's really, I think that's really cool. I like that. I admire that.
Thank you. I'm a lucky boy. I got to study the stuff I love doing. This is me and with a sturgeon. It just out in the Ottawa River a couple of months ago. Can't wait to do that too. And that's the real fun stuff. Is like that's where I learn the most is out there. And it was really if you got a minute. I mean, this was the really eye opening because I wrote a paper on sturgeon, one of my first papers, but this is the first time I held a live one, and uh, my kids start school every day with the land acknowledgement, and I do with my talks now because this is Anishinaabe land, and they know where these animals live and how many there are better than the person doing conservation work on it. I actually call like the dinner data principle, like life dinner principle. It's like I can collect data, but never know as much as the people collecting these organisms for dinner. So I always try to remember that. So even if I'm been to a place 500 times, I just don't know as much as the people that live in that area. Just can't gain that experience. So trying to incorporate that in this age of COVID into my talks and understanding of the world.
I'm going to draw an analogy, and maybe you can say this is cheesy, but so my interpretation of your work, and I've known you for quite a long time, and followed your stuff for a long time, is you've kind of like jumped in these like niches, like cave fishes. Like it's a really specific niche, and from that you tell really big stories around biodiversity, around evolution and time. What I'm kind of hearing now from you is you're taking that really niche career of like cave fishes and being a professor at LSU, and you're telling bigger stories, right? Like you're exploring all these new mediums. A recurring theme seems to be all the different ways, whether that's traditional landowners, or John Edmondson, like these different skill sets that really influence scientific thinking that are underappreciated. Bringing those diversity of perspectives kind of into the scientific world and saying like that we need everybody in this. We need everybody. Is that a fair analogy, or is that too cheesy?
I love it. I really appreciate that. Yeah, you sort of. I felt like I had to play the game to get up the ladder, and now I want to help other people that weren't allowed to or didn't have the same privilege to help climb the same ladder and see if we can change science. And there's a lot of people doing this that we know, that both of us mutually know. I have a lot of fun with what I do, and I think I'm lucky in that it didn't feel like a chore to do the academic route. I loved it, and I've had great mentors, and so I just want to be a great mentor for those folks and give voice to those that haven't had it before. And who gets to do that? That's so rare, that you just don't look down and say I made it, you didn't. You gotta teach other people to learn how to climb the ladder too. And I've just been so lucky to be able to do that. I haven't always done a great job at that. I haven't had the opportunities always, and had to learn that. And so, yeah, thanks for that analogy. I love it. It's not cheesy at all.
Cool. The last question I always ask folks, and you've given a lot of examples so far, so feel free to pass, but what are your best ideas for making science better?
Yeah. For me, we talked a lot about the funding model in the US. We do a lot of great science in the US, but we more and more we leave it in the US. We bring it from other places. And it's really hard to fund, my student from Guatemala to work in Guatemala or to bring somebody in from the field, for lots of NSF grants, it's US taxpayer money and they want to keep US taxpayer dollars in-house in the States. But the opportunities to work with somebody in Haiti, where there's a lot less infrastructure, even though it's so close to the US, to actually fund somebody to bring them back, train them, send them back and train others, it's getting harder and harder to do. It's so tough to bring that money outside of the US. Even though you're allowed to do international work, bringing the international partners to the US to train them, that's different pots of money. You have to find, and it's not the program officers that want to do that. It's not the NSF that wants to do that, or DARPA. It's just a fear of where taxpayer dollars go, and the fear that if you let that money go out, it's not going to come back. But in fact, if we do share those funds, it comes back doubly. You're training more people to do the science locally so that you can work internationally. You can make those connections permanent instead of ephemeral. And that's the one thing I do, is permit more international science between countries, and remembering that little bit of investment in in the places that you work really brings back that global network, and eventually funding too. Once they get good at it, you can do even better science. I've just learned so much from, especially my students that I've worked with, who've been in my lab, who I met in the field. The fine scale stuff that they do, I couldn't do just visiting once or twice. So having somebody who's lived in those areas just have taught me so much more about the places that I love to work. And so more infrastructure, scientific infrastructure, funding for that'd be great. That's how I would change the funding model.
You're here. I love it. Well, Prosanta, this has been so great. I can't wait for all of your different books and projects to come out, to read them. Keep us posted, and thanks again. I appreciate it.
Thanks, man. I love talking to you. So I can't wait to see you in person and give you a big hug and tease you. So.
Likewise. All right, cool. See ya.